Will you pray with me? Gracious and loving God, we stand here today knocking, seeking, asking for your presence. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you now and forever, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Today we begin to tell the story of Nehemiah. And if you go into your Old Testament, you will find a whole book devoted to Nehemiah. And Nehemiah comes to us at a time when we find the Israelites in exile. They had been brought into exile by the Babylonians, and now they find themselves under the rule of the Persian Empire, who conquered Babylon. Under the Babylonians, they found absolutely no religious freedom whatsoever. In fact, as we heard when we studied the story of Esther, in fact, many of the Israelites were under constant persecution, even sometimes under the threat of death. But Esther helped to change that. Esther actually became a Persian queen and started to turn the perspective of the king. So much so that the Israelite people finally became a part of the culture and not expected to be assimilated into that culture. And Nehemiah is an ordinary guy. He's a servant of the king. In fact, he's referred to as a cupbearer. But Nehemiah comes from Jerusalem. That's where his family is from. That's where all of his relatives are. Many of his relatives are buried there. That's home for him. And he misses his home. Now, in Nehemiah's day, there was no Twitter, there was no Facebook, there was no internet, there was no post office. The only way that things were communicated about what was happening in Jerusalem were that people would travel. And when travelers would come, they would relay information about what was happening back home. And one fateful day, a messenger arrives, and Nehemiah overhears that Jerusalem is in shambles. The walls, the literal walls, are busted open, broken down. Wild animals can come and go as they please. Intruders, thieves. It has become a wasteland. Jerusalem, the great city, has become a wasteland. And it sets upon Nehemiah's heart that he needs to do something. And in the very first chapter of Nehemiah's story, he does something that sometimes we often forget to do. He goes right to prayer, right to seeking God's guidance for what he is to do. This one ordinary guy, what can he do? And the call upon his heart is, you must rebuild the walls. Not resurrect the city, but rebuild the walls. Because you have to start somewhere. And Nehemiah hears this call loud and clear, and he is ready and willing to go, but there's one problem. He's a servant. And he's a servant to a king. And if you're a good servant to the king, do they really want to let you go? No. He's fulfilling his duty. The king loves him. He wants him to stay there. But yet Nehemiah knows that he is called to be somewhere else. And this is where he not only boldly asks God for what he needs, but he boldly asks the king as well. And with sort of fear and trepidation, Nehemiah goes before the king because he has heard God say, "Go, because you will have the passage you need to get to Jerusalem." And sort of shaking and quaking before the king, Nehemiah comes forward and asks for what he needs. Boldly, a servant asking of the king for indefinite time off, to go back to a foreign country, to rebuild and fortify the walls of a country that could end up becoming the enemy of the king for whom he's serving. That's a pretty bold ask, right? Any of you in HR? Anybody come to you and say, "Hey, I need an indefinite leave of absence. I'm going to head down to Texas, rebuild the Alamo." Does that sound like something you would allow them to do? Probably not. But we remember now, today, we hear the echo of that gospel reading we just heard from Matthew. Ask, and you shall receive. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened for you. And a door was opened for Nehemiah. The king, moved by Nehemiah's story, approves somehow this project, and not only sends Nehemiah back to Jerusalem, but sends him with a note of safe passage, sends him with an order for the materials to rebuild the walls in Jerusalem. So this bold ask, this bold seeking, comes to fruition as Nehemiah sets out to rebuild the walls. And next week, we'll hear about how that went. But for this week, it's enough to know that that bold ask came with an answer. It's hard to believe, but it's been almost 10 years ago that this congregation undertook a major building project of its own. I first arrived here in 2002, and I know that the vision for this church and the vision for this building project came way before I even came on the scene. I had heard stories from Obed, the previous pastor, as well as from many of you, that there was a vision for adding to this church for somewhere near on 20 years. But that vision never died. And that vision caught fire. Because we knew as a congregation that the demographics of this area were changing. That more and more people were moving into this area. That there was a real opportunity for evangelism, to talk about and to share God's love and Christ's word with the people and the community here in Cottage Grove. And so many people boldly came forward to support that vision, gave generously and sacrificially in order for this to become a reality. Because that vision asked us to ask God for what we needed for this community. And what have been the rewards of that building? But that this family has grown, that more than hundreds of families have received the care and nurture of the church at some of the most vulnerable times in their lives, as they have said goodbye and laid their loved ones to rest. That without this bold vision, there would not be a farmer's market here every summer where hundreds and thousands of people come each week to get good and healthy food, to live into our vision of being fed both physically and spiritually. And for this community to be able to celebrate and to worship as we feel called to. It was a bold vision, and it came to be a reality. And we continue to ask and to seek and to find God's guidance. Because this was a big project and there was no king to approve all the building materials. There was no one that gave this the full stamp of approval for funding. But yet we found a way through your generosity, through your vision for what this church can and will be. And today we will consecrate those gifts that will go to finish the job, to complete this part of the vision, to open new doors to a new era of ministry at Cottage Grove UCC. In our own way as a community, we are living out Nehemiah's story. For why we are not rebuilding something. We are building something for God here in Old Cottage Grove. A church that will be here for generations and generations to come, to see Afton grow to have her own children who will come and be baptized here. To be a family that will continue to support and encourage one another in those most difficult times, as we will again this week for a very close member of our family in John Greenwell. We come to build for the future, for God is in this place. And God will never leave. Let us give thanks for that grace and glory. When we boldly ask, we will receive. Now let us give thanks for the showers of blessings. Can I get an amen? Amen.
Jesus, you're my firm foundation. I know I can stand secure. Jesus, you're my firm foundation. I put my hope in your holy word. I put my hope in your